Happy New Year.
Yes, Happy New Year. Had a rather delayed start to podcasting in 2025, but here we are back again.
Yeah, we had a nice, a longish Christmas break, at least when it comes to the podcast.
But lots has been happening while we've been away, so we should catch up with a few announcements. Actually, there's one announcement which happened, I think it was maybe even yesterday as we record this. Which is so there's obviously a whole load of Swift working groups that have been created and have been running for the last few years. Things from like the Swift website work group is one that I'm a member of. There's a Swift documentation work group which both of us are members of. There's lots of these working groups that have. There's a contributor experience one, I think. And probably some. There's the diversity work group as well. So there's lots of these work groups that are going on, and so far they've all been organised by the Swift team. But I noticed a post yesterday, which was the announcement of a community working group. So it is a Swift on Android community work group. Organised by Ioannis Orlandos, and it's intending to, I guess, either be a precursor to an official one or just for it to exist on its own, with the goal of promoting and working towards broader and faster adoption for Swift on Android.
Yeah, I was actually wondering if that's an official group or what even makes an official group. It sounded like this was a group on as a peer to the other groups, but I guess the community work group is slightly different. It's a bit unclear, but then again, I mean,
maybe I've assumed it's less official than it is. The only reason that made me make that assumption is because it was called a community work group, which I guessed was being organized without the involvement of the Swift team, although they may be involved.
Well, certainly, if you look through the announcement post, the replies, I think there's immediately people started being active and interested in contributing, especially people from other working groups, the platform steering group.
Yes, there have been more posts since I checked it yesterday.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. Really interesting, and I think it sort of also highlights that Android is, like, looking at the activity, it seems to indicate that Android is an interesting additional platform. It seems there's quite a bit of interest in getting this off the ground, and maybe that's I mean, some of this is so two members are Marc Prudhomme and Abe White of Skip Tools, and you had this in iOS Dev Weekly recently, right?
Yes.
Marc Prudhomme's compatibility page where he's testing Android compatibility of packages. It's actually, I think, based on our package list, a subset of it at least. And
I believe it is,
yeah. And I think there's value in considering whether we should start running Android tests, and maybe that's an indication, like the amount of activity there and how well that's being received.
Yeah.
Whether that's the next platform, one of the next platforms we should be looking at.
Yeah, I think it's always good to see people interested in bringing it to more platforms, and to see people organized like this and kind of put some structure to it is even better. And like you say, Mark and Abe from Skip Tools, I'm very happy and not surprised to see them involved in this, because their product is also entirely around bringing apps written in Swift to Android.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's great. I mean, I think it's always nice to see community, or maybe it is official. Maybe you're right that this is exactly an official work group, but it's just got a different word in it.
Or it might be a precursor and become one. It's not entirely clear from the announcement. But then again, I mean, does it really matter all that much? I think the point is that there's a group that deals with sort of pulls all the different bits and pieces together, because there have been a couple of efforts in the past targeting Android, and I think it's great to see that this is like becoming a joint effort where this is going to be turning into a proper SDK with proper support and all that, and a group of people who look after it. Good to see.
And it's also great to see that the as you say, the people in that thread, there are a mix of Apple people, or should I say Swift team people, and community members. So it's great to see, even if this is not an official work group, it's great to see the Apple people immediately getting involved, which is just lovely to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, there's been another bit of news quite recently at FOSDEM. That was the Swift build announcement. I think you had some notes on that, didn't you?
Yeah, it's. I think this is a very exciting project. It's been a thorn in Swift's side for a little while now that there are effectively two entire build systems. One which is Xcode build, which is part of Xcode, either running through the Xcode application itself or running through the command line tool Xcode build. And then there is the entirely different Swift build command, which is not as capable in terms of trying to build every type of product that Xcode can build, but is cross-platform compatible and works on Linux and works everywhere, and so they both have advantages. And one of the artifacts of having two build systems for Swift is a little bit of complexity that we've had to put into the Swift package index, which is, in order to determine macOS compatibility for a package, we have to attempt both the Swift build and an Xcode build, because some packages will build with Swift build and some packages will build with Xcode, and it's not necessarily the case that you'll always build with either one of those two, so you have to kind of do both to get compatibility. So we've been in this situation where we've got these two build systems, and that is really less than ideal. And as I understand it, the primary purpose of Swift build is to get one unified build system across both of those situations.
Yeah, I just can't wait for this to be, fully unified, and obviously we won't be able to drop our running of two builds in parallel with Swift build and Xcode build for a while, but at least there's now a future where we can delete all that duplication and that extra maintenance stuff. So
Is it actually the case that we may have to, in fact, run three builds for a little while?
Oh God, no. I think the minute this is sort of switched on, which is, I presume that would be a WWDC announcement that this is the,
I would imagine so, yeah,
now official build system for, what is it going to be, Swift 6.2, I suppose. I think at that point
and Xcode 17.
Yeah, I think at that point we do whatever is the default, but there has to be a date when it's the default, and I think that's the date for us to sort of unify it, and then we just have to wait for the older Swift versions to drop off the matrix, and then we can finally delete the duplication of running these builds and the documentation generation, which is also sort of, we have to maintain two different ways of doing that, and it's just, I'm just super glad about this.
Even if we won't be running three builds per package, we may end up running three build systems for a while, because for the Xcode 17 Swift 6.x, whatever that is, that will need the new build system, and the old two, as you say, will be there for previous versions until they drop off, which is probably several years away.
yeah. Well, my hope
the
is
complexity gets worse for a little bit, but this is in the pursuit of a better solution. So I'm still happy to see it.
Yeah, absolutely. Plus, from what I've seen, it's effectively a flag on Swift build, I believe, to use the new build system, obviously with a corresponding tool chain. And I think in Xcode build might even have the same, that you can use Xcode build as the front end to use the build system. I'm not sure how Swift, like the Apple platforms would work, because right now you can't really build for iOS and tvOS and stuff with Swift build. But I suppose all this will sort of be part of that. I mean, the open sourcing of Swift build is sort of, I think, a requirement to actually have Swift packages that you use, that you build iOS apps from, like you do with Swift build, which you right now need to use Xcode for. So there has to be a world where this is also unified, and I suppose this is the first step towards that. Well, I certainly hope that's the case, because otherwise we have gained nothing.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm confident that what you laid out there is their intention.
Yeah. Let's see what happens in June.
Exciting times for build systems on Swift. It's not a topic that a lot of people imagine that they'll care a lot about, but here we are.
Here we are. There's another bit of news which is a bit older. I had this in my notes for a while. There was an interesting forum thread on the Swift forums about open source funding. This was opened by Taylor Swift, user Taylor Swift, Diana, on the Swift forums. And this is interesting in itself. So Diana, raises some, or brings up some thoughts how open source can be funded and maintained, such that it's not just on free labor of people who are volunteering their time to work on stuff. But I also noticed an interesting link in that thread. So the thread is from December, and someone brought up a bounty platform that's being used by tourists, apparently, and it's called Algora. And a person jumped in the thread and said they've actually updated the platform to be Swift specific. So I think there's some Swift specific stuff, and there's swift.algora.io is the homepage, and it's a bounty and tipping platform where you can use GitHub commands to put out bounties and give tips inside issues and pull requests. So you could have an issue where you do a /bounty and then a dollar amount, or equally you have an issue and you do /tip dollar amount and username and tip someone an amount of money, which I found really, really interesting, like an interesting way to get funding into an open source project. Also slightly, what makes me a bit nervous that there's a / command where you can, spend money, like real money. That seems like super easy. But then again, that's the point, right? To make it easy to get, to make it easy for people to actually fund stuff. And I thought that's really interesting, maybe to think about and talk about and see if that's something you could use. I think often, and we've talked about this in the past, the problem is not that companies don't have the money or even the willingness to fund open source work. It's the how, right? There's how do I get the credit card into the right person's hands to then make a payment to the maintainer? It's really strange or often difficult that an open source maintainer doesn't have a company set up, doesn't have a billing set up, and I can't really get to the money that might even be there. It's this disconnect between, there's a service that's being offered effectively and needed, but the person who needs it doesn't really control the money and needs to get approval from somewhere. And big companies, that's often a huge headache to it's easy to buy a book or to fly to a conference than get money into a maintainer's hand is effectively what I'm trying to say. And if companies were set up to be able to have a pool of money for bounties, and then certain members of the team who control that and could dole that out that way, that might be interesting, or might be a good approach to help fix this problem.
I think there's two sides of it. I think you're absolutely right that there is that one of the sides is getting that credit card into the system, actually being able to make the payment. But the other part, especially as the companies that you're dealing with get bigger, the other part is having approval. So like people will have, like you mentioned, it's easy to get approval for a book or something like that will help you learn something, because companies have in place the mechanism for staff training and that kind of thing. And so you can normally find a bucket to put stuff in you can find a bucket to put almost everything you want in a company, and open source funding there is no bucket for open source funding in most companies.
And that's the unfortunate thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's all very easy for a company to wave their hand and say, oh yeah, we should support open source software, and it's a whole different thing to actually get to the point where getting that credit card is the problem. So you have to have that pre-credit card bit, which is let's make a bucket for open source funding, and that's obviously a much bigger and more difficult conversation inside most companies. I do think, though, that just looking at this site, that this seems like a great way to do that second step in the chain. But I wonder if there's anything they can do. Like, can they prepare, like, here's a kit that you can take to your your finance department to explain why you should support open source, and get that first bit done as well, because that's obviously, I think, the bigger of the two problems. Although I think this is great.
Yeah, I think it's a bit like, at some point companies decided, well, it's actually helpful to have a training budget, a conference budget.
Right.
But companies at some point need to realize, well, it's actually not only helpful but even critical to also have an open source maintenance budget, because they're leaning on that work, and there's going to be a point where the risk is just going to be really high if stuff falls in disrepair and isn't being maintained. And I think it's about time that this gets on people's radar, that this is really critical. But there's another point I wanted to make, and I actually replied in the forum thread about this. And that's that this sort of stuff is often quite transactional in the sense that, and /bounty is an example of it. I put a bounty on this issue. I think open source work doesn't always fall into a clear feature or a clear bug fix. Sometimes it's just maintenance, and that can be updating dependencies, updating CI, modernizing the code base, with language or dependency changes, that stuff. A CVE popping up, and you can't start a bounty program once the CVE has already happened. You sort of need to have someone there who knows the code base and can jump in and fix it. And there needs to be an understanding that there is just base level maintenance that needs to be paid, and that is doing these tasks that are listed, but also having someone who actually knows the code base, because you can't start ramping up when stuff is really urgent. You sort of need to keep the engine running on some level to have actually people there who can make the changes. And I think that sometimes gets overlooked in these discussions when open source is talked about, because it's about a next big feature, a big bug fix or stuff like that, and it just doesn't always come in nice little packages like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the maintenance point is really well made, and certainly for some, the more popular your open source project becomes, the more important things like that becomes, because it is impossible to ignore CVEs at some point if you have an open source project which has got significant usage out in the wild. But that's the kind of stuff that's really hard to get people to, like you say, it's hard to.
Yeah.
That's not bounty work. That's work that you need. Yeah. I guess that's what a core team is for, right? On most projects of any significant size have a core team of maintainers, and funding that core team of maintainers is a different problem. Which, yeah, I mean, open source funding, we could talk for hours on open source funding. I think it's something we both have lots of thoughts on. But I'm glad to see any kind of initiative like this to help, and this one does look good.
Yeah, let's see what comes of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get on to recommendations this week, there's just a little kind of public service announcement that I want to make, which is, as I was looking through all of the packages to, figure out what I was going to talk about this week, there's a common problem, and I'm finally going to talk about it, which is README files. So as you've made this new package, you've created something that you're very passionate about, and you want to tell the world about it. So you write your README file, and of course, as the package author, you're very familiar with the subject matter area, and so you start writing, and it's very easy to assume a lot of knowledge that that the people reading it might not have, and I see this problem all the time in terms of package readmes. And I came across one. This is not part of the picks for this week, but I will mention this one package because I think it was a great example of this, and it was a package called FIT Parser, FIT Parser, which has a great README file. And it explains exactly how to use the package, and it tells you how to import it, and it tells you how to add it to your dependencies, and all the rest of it. But it doesn't tell you what these FIT files that it's dealing with are. And only at the very bottom of the README file did I spot a mention of Garmin, and it turns out that these FIT files are Garmin kind of workout data or route data or something like that. But it took me getting to the bottom of a 500,000 word 500 or 1,000 word README to figure that out. And I thought it was just worth mentioning that try and read your README file from the perspective of someone who has absolutely no domain knowledge at all before publishing a package, because I'm not sure whether I would have picked this to read, but there's a good chance that most people wouldn't even have got to the bottom of the README file. They would have just moved on. I was actually going to do a conference talk once. I even started to write it, but I forget why the conference. I think the conference was postponed or cancelled or something like that. And I was going to talk about README files for open source projects and relate it to kind of marketing your app to the public, because what you're actually doing with the README file is you're marketing your package to developers. And so there's a whole load of similarities between what you need to do to get a successful app marketed to people in the real world on the App Store, and what you need to do that for developers on the Swift Package Index. Maybe I'll resurrect that conference talk and do it at some conference sometime, because I think there's a lot that could be improved in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose we sort of look at more READMEs than normal, but still it is quite noticeable that sometimes people assume a bit too much about their package. And the other thing is I often see lengthy installation and usage instructions, which
me too. I don't understand it.
I think it's a bit tricky, right? Because if your package is just on GitHub and it's not surrounded by any of Swift.org or maybe even the Swift Package Index, where there is other places on how to use it, right? We have the pop-up use this package, where it guides you through that. If you look at a package outside that context, there is no other immediate surrounding context to fill that in. But I guess at some point,
my issue there is it's not the mention of installation. It's the depth which people go to.
And then there's Carthage and Xcode,
so mentioning exactly, like mentioning this is compatible with Swift Package Manager, CocoaPods, and Carthage,
and then link out.
That's it. That's all you need to say. You don't need to say how. Maybe you need the pod name exactly. But yeah, it's quite often kind of half the README file is installation.
I guess in some cases it's from an era when it wasn't that obvious, right? When you had to sort of, well, how do I use it? Was it pod or is it Carthage? And
of course. And it also becomes a
Yeah.
kind of a standard within the community. Oh, like, well, everyone else is telling people how to install it, so I need to do the same.
Yeah.
I think there's a bit of that happening as well.
We've been running quite long, but there is actually one other topic I'd like to bring up before we do our recommendations, and that's another interesting thread. It's a pitch on the Swift forums. It's about last expression as return value, and the reason is twofold. I wanted to talk about this. So, it's an interesting technical discussion. It's quite lengthy. It's a super popular thread, and so what it's about is, like in a map, you can omit return, and it'll return the value, and that's sort of a rule. If it's a single line expression, you elide the return. That makes code more concise.
Yes.
And there's now a discussion to make that a general rule, like the last expression will be taken as the return value. And you're very passionate Ruby developer as well, right? Where that is actually normal, right? That's a standard in Ruby, as I understand, isn't it?
It is, and it's something that so I am, or I was, a Ruby developer, and it's something that never really quite sat right with me in Ruby. I think there are situations where it makes sense. If you've got one exit from a function and it's the last line, then that's fine. But in almost every other situation, I thought that was a negative point of the language, actually. And I agreed. I thought it was great when Swift added the single line return. So it's where there is nothing else that could be happening other than a return, it's fine. And I thought that was a reasonable change to the language. But I'm not sure I would want to see it.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion, and I like these threads that are bounce back and forth, and there's lots of people making great points this way and that way. It's like, I just don't want to be the person who has to decide this in the end, but I loved reading it and seeing people throw around ideas and explaining why it's a good idea or a bad idea, and it's sort of a meta discussion about how this is being debated that I wanted to talk a bit about. I find the general quality of discussion, the depth and the breadth, to be really, really good. Like in the forums in general, I know people have conflicted thoughts about the Swift forums, but I in general find like the discussion is really high quality, and sometimes it flames up a bit, but I think it's for internet forums it's actually really good. One thing I noticed in this thread in particular, and there are threads like this where there's lots of participation, and that's around topics that are not as technical, right? Whether to return and how to return in the last expression isn't on the same level as talking about some of this existential stuff or distributed actors, and that's where I find it impossible to contribute there because it's so technical. But here, the audience is broader. It's easier to add thoughts. But even so, it struck me that when the developer experience is brought up in this context, it's typically brought up by people on behalf of other groups. So it struck me that it almost always only enters the discussion via a representative. The Swift forums are really technical, and it isn't a fair, an unbiased representation of the whole Swift ecosystem of developers, right? Only the people who are really interested in the language and are typically quite experienced end up on the Swift forums, and then end up entering these discussions, right? So it's really highly selective towards a more experienced crowd, which then means the opinions only get related. People will say, well, I teach Swift and this is what people struggle with, but it's not the people themselves who are struggling who actually come to the forums and say, look, this might be problematic. And I think of course, that is kind of a bit problematic. I'm sure the people who make the decision will look very carefully at who's making these points on behalf of others, but I think it's important to understand a single person raising a concern about a whole group of people, pupils, students, has to be weighed differently. And and there is not going to be a fix, like it's not going to change overnight, or maybe even in general that suddenly this would be representative to the whole demographics. But I wonder if it might help if certain topics are perhaps highlighted to be explicitly inviting people who aren't as experienced to come and look and contribute and give their points of view. Like, call out, your opinion is really valuable, because you can't undo your experience, right? It's really hard sometimes to participate in discussions that shouldn't be about the most experienced people entering and saying, well, I don't have a problem with it because I understand Swift and I've been doing this for 2 decades. This maybe should be called out specifically. We're talking about last expression. What do you specifically, as a beginner, think? Would this confuse you? Would this make it perhaps easier for you to work with Swift? And
I think I get your point here, and it's a good point. I think looping back to what you said at the beginning of your discussion there about the Swift forums being, I think the Swift forums have improved an enormous amount since they started. When they started, I was so put off by them and the kind of the conversations and the attitude of in threads on them that I completely stopped visiting them for maybe even years. And they have improved beyond belief since that point. But they are still quite an intimidating place to post. I certainly feel intimidated before posting anything there, and that stops me from contributing to everything that I would potentially otherwise contribute to. And I think even if you were being requested your feedback was being requested, I think it would still be quite an intimidating place to enter one of those threads, because it's full of, as you say, people who are very passionate about Swift and who spend a lot of time thinking about language design, which is not something a novice even considers. Language design is something that almost by definition you only have an opinion on once you know the language.
Yeah, definitely, I get that. Yeah.
So I think it's I get your point, and it's a good point. I just don't know. I don't know how to solve it. I think the Swift forums are still quite intimidating, and I think finding the people who would have those opinions and would be able to post them, I think would be challenging.
I think that's the point, to try and make it more inviting. I think it's a huge problem for the forums if someone like you, who's very experienced and a very well respected member in the community, feels intimidated by the forums for the programming language of that community. I think that's a huge problem. And I don't want to point. I feel the same. There's topics where I'm not considering contributing, even if I have a remote thought that might be useful, because this is out of my league. But I think that's the problem. I think for the forums to be really representative of the people actually using the language, it is a problem when people are intimidated by the main platform where discussion is happening.
Yes.
And I think that's why maybe some pitches, not all of them, for some pitches there's just no hope. You need people who are super technical. But I think it might be worthwhile considering some pitches or evolution proposals to specifically call out, look, give it a thought if you have thoughts, and post them, and specifically invite contributions. Maybe it does nothing, but it can't hurt. I think that's why it can't hurt to call that out and maybe prod people into replying, and maybe then people could help along a bit by saying, like, applauding people who actually come to the front and post something and encourage them further. I think that'd be a good thing to happen.
I agree.
Okay, that was a longer news section than normal.
Yes, maybe we'll keep the picks to a slightly shorter number of picks today. I will kick us off. And actually, so my first pick is a double pick, and also related to something that you did on the Swift Package Index a little while ago. I know that when we were doing the documentation build system, and specifically uploading the documentation to Amazon S3, what we do is we zip the documentation after we build it, and then ship it to S3, and then using a Lambda function on AWS, we unzip it and put it into the right place on S3, because we found that moving lots of files individually was not practical up to S3. But I know that over the years since that original system got implemented, we've had a couple of issues where the zip tool that we used didn't quite do what we wanted it to do. I think there was a bug at one point which caused us to try a different one which didn't quite work in the same way, and it seemed like there are a couple of prominent kind of zip tools, but none of them do exactly what we wanted, or at least we hit some issues with them. And I noticed as I was looking through all the packages since the beginning of the year that there have been two new zip tools added to the package index, both of which look to be completely new, as in not kind of forked from other things or created from other projects. Although I may be wrong, I'm not an expert in either of them, of course. One of them is called Zip, simply Zip, by Thomas Franzen, which has been in development for 2 months, and it can deal with zip files, both file-based and in memory. You can configure the compression levels. You've got a Swift API. You've got this kind of fairly nice API into a zip file. And the other one is called Swift Zip Archive from Adam Fowler. And that's been in development for about a month. So both of them look to be completely new. And if you have hit problems with a zip tool in Swift before, they might be something that you want to check out.
Yeah, I was super excited to see. I actually hadn't seen the first one you mentioned. I'd seen Adam Fowler's zip, and I actually have that on my to-do list because, as you mentioned, we had trouble with zip. Zip is just fiendishly annoying and complex and weird. Where when you zip stuff, sometimes you stuff gets pulled from a tree and is a flat list of files inside the zip, and then you lose the path. It's super annoying. So currently we're actually using 2 different zippers, one that is zipping, the other is unzipping, because of compatibility issues. It's a nightmare. Right, I really want to try at least Adam's, and then also perhaps the other if there are still problems, just to replace that contraption that we're using right now.
I thought it was. I thought of that issue obviously when I saw both of these, but it's also kind of interesting that both have popped up within a month of each other. So there was obviously something in the air over the holidays that made people go, maybe I should write a zip library.
There's a little zip competition going on there.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. But yeah, something to check out if you have files to zip or unzip.
My first pick is a package you, I believe, also mentioned in your iOS Dev Weekly newsletter, and that's Forked by Drew McCormack. And this looks like a really nice and powerful library to handle shared data in a Git-like model. So you have different data sources, and they just sync. Might have an app that edits text, and you want to have edits happening independently. And the nice thing about this is you can sort of branch stuff and then have custom merging strategies per data type, and it allows you to customize that. And there's a really interesting example I think it's in the README. If not the README, it's in a documentation to explain how that can work. So there's an incrementing integer that is used in 2 different apps, and the way the merging strategy works, you can easily see how that could be conflicting, right? The increment, decrement independently, and then they want to sync and they have different values, right? And it's unclear who should win, because you make a mistake if you just let the last win, because any counting that happened on the other side would then be gobbled up. And the way you can easily fix that and make that really reliably syncing is that each just takes the delta to its last non-merge state where it branched off, right? And then you can actually add up the deltas and you get a reliable merge, because any action that happened in between would still be reflected in the total outcome. It would just happen independently and asynchronously. And if you have a data type that has that has that domain knowledge, sort of domain behavior, and you can write a sync merging algorithm like that, then this is really great, because you can create a distributed system that actually merges reliably without potential conflicts. And you can see how you can even build up larger types if you can break it down into small components that have all sort of merging strategies like that are actually resolvable. It's not always the case. Sometimes you just can't resolve, and you have to let last change win, or whatever it might be. But sometimes your domain model is like that. You know exactly what the outcome should be, and then you have the power with this tool, with this package, to implement it that way. And I found that really interesting. I hadn't seen anything like it. So the other, we've talked about CRDTs, I think is the acronym. I don't even remember what the
conflict-free resolution
something.
Yeah.
But what they try and do is giving you an auto merge, so you don't have to. You have no way of actually injecting a merging strategy. But from what I've seen is that you will end up with conflict-free merges that are conceptually correct, but give you really weird result, especially when it's around text and edited text, because you get stuff that is correctly merged, like in the sense technically there was no conflict, but the result is kind of garbage that comes out of it. Not complete garbage, but the edits would conflict in weird ways. And my understanding is that's actually not resolvable. So in these cases, it really helps if you have a data type that you fully understand, and where you can define a merging strategy that makes sense, not just technically but also semantically, and allows you to handle edits that happen independently. So if you have need for a shared data model, I think that's a great package to look at, and I believe it can work on top of iCloud and stuff, so it's not like it's tied to any sort of persistence strategy or even syncing mechanism. It really deals with it at the model layer, and you can have the underlying stuff. You just save files, I think, effectively, and handle the merging at a higher layer.
And Drew has been working on this kind of stuff for many, many years now. This has been a kind of passion of his for a long time, and I think it probably came out of his work on, I think it's Ensembles, which is the product that he makes, which is an open source, or you can buy a version of it that gets the source or something like that, which is a synchronization framework for cloud synchronization of local data. So yeah, this has been on his mind for many, many years. So it's something that this is not someone who's just had an idea and has started writing stuff. This is I would imagine extremely well researched and based on.
Well, and Drew is the co-author of Agenda, the calendar note-taking app on macOS, iOS. So he does syncing. His app does syncing. It doesn't come out of nowhere. That
he does syncing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. My final package for this week is Skin Smoothing Filter by Shima. And this is a package that that effectively takes, so it uses Metal and Core Image, and it takes an image. The example image in the README is a picture of a face and kind of shoulders portrait picture, and it smooths the skin on the person's face. So there's obviously some kind of blurring going on because some bits of the image are kind of blurry, but it's identified the bits that it needs to keep in focus, like the eyes and hair and things like that. It doesn't mention the technology it uses to identify the bits that it doesn't smooth or how it detects the skin that it wants to smooth. But what it does say is it uses metal, which is the 3D framework underneath the entire iPhone. This was the replacement for OpenGL. So I'm guessing that's how they're doing the actual drawing and core image to actually turn it back into an image again. But it doesn't have any huge detail on how it's doing the job. But it's doing a very good job. You can see the picture in the README file for an example, and the lady in the picture has freckles, and those freckles are effectively smoothed out in the resulting image. So I thought it was not probably something you're going to use every day, but it was something interesting that I came across as I was looking through all the packages this month.
Right, my second and final pick is called Numerics by Gavin Wiggins. And that looks like a really great library for linear algebra, like vectors and matrices. It's using the Accelerate framework under the hood.
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably very important when you do this sort of thing. In general, you typically don't have just one matrix or small matrix to multiply. You often do this over and over, so you are quite you have performance concerns. That's probably something you're thinking about, and then the Accelerate framework will give you massive boosts. And I also noticed in the README, the package does really nice ASCII art printouts of matrices and vectors, so it lays them out a bit, which I always find really nice, because you might be debugging that sort of stuff, and what do we do when we debug? We put print statements in our code and print stuff out, and then it's just really nice to see it,
Sure.
not just in a long flat list or stuff like that. So I found that really, really neat about the package to also have that taken care of. So yeah, that's Numerics with an X at the end by Gavin Wiggins.
That's useful to include that information. I would have searched for the spelling of numerics, the regular spelling. Well, we'll leave it there then, shall we? So thanks for listening, and we will be back in a few weeks with another episode. Promise not to leave it as long as we did over the holidays for the next one. And yeah, we'll see you in a few weeks.
See you next time. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.